There are words that do more than communicate. There are words that unlock doors that were never supposed to open again. Words that carry the weight of decades, the scent of a country left behind, the echo of a woman long buried, a woman whose name most people forgot before she even died. London Page did not know she was carrying one of those words. She walked into the Choi estate the way she did everything, quietly, carefully, with her eyes slightly down and her hands folded in front of her. She was 28 years old and had spent most of her life learning how to take up as little space as possible. She was new staff. She knew her place. The old man was at the top of the staircase when she arrived. 71 years old, powerful in the way only men who have survived things become powerful. He barely glanced at her. And then she opened her mouth. She said the only greeting she knew in Korean, the one her grandmother had taught her. The dialect was old, coastal, from a region most modern Koreans couldn't even place. It was not standard. It was not Seoul. It was something that belonged to a very specific stretch of land and a very specific time, and it had no business coming out of the mouth of a young American woman standing in a marble foyer in Chicago. The old man's face went white. He grabbed the railing, his knuckles strained, and London, who had no idea what she had just done, smiled softly and looked down at her shoes. That was the beginning of everything. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. New stories every week. Hit the bell so you never miss a moment like this. Drop a comment. Have you ever said something innocent and watched it shatter someone's composure? The Choi estate sat on a private stretch of lakefront property on the north shore of Chicago, the kind of neighborhood where the houses were never called houses. They were residences. They were estates. They were the physical proof that certain families had, at some point in the past, done something large enough to purchase permanence. London arrived on a Tuesday in early March 2026. The sky was the particular shade of gray that Chicago wore for about 5 months out of every year. A gray that felt less like weather and more like a mood. She had her duffel bag on one shoulder and a small potted succulent tucked under her arm, because her grandmother had always said that you should bring something living into any new home you enter. It was a habit London had never been able to shake, even when the home was not hers. The housekeeper who let her in was a brisk Korean woman named Mrs. O, somewhere in her 60s, who communicated in clipped English sentences and seemed deeply uninterested in anything beyond efficiency. The job was simple. London would work 6 days a week as a domestic assistant. Laundry, light cooking when the cook had days off, general upkeep of the residential wing. She would have her own room on the staff floor. The pay was generous, more than generous, actually, which was why London had taken it, despite the fact that live-in work always made her uneasy, always made her feel like she was borrowing a life that didn't belong to her. She was shown to her room. She unpacked. She set the succulent on the windowsill. Then she went to meet the household. The main family consisted of 2 people in residence. Choi Jae-sung, the patriarch, 71 years old, and the kind of man whose retirement looked like most people's full-time employment. Meetings, phone calls, consultations, a steady stream of suited individuals who arrived and departed without making eye contact with the staff. And his son, Seo Won Choi, 34 years old, who ran the family's investment portfolio and worked from the estate's private office wing more days than not. London met the father first. She had been told he would be in the east sitting room at 10 o'clock and that she should introduce herself. She practiced the Korean greeting in her head the whole walk down the corridor. Her grandmother had made her learn it when she was small, 6, 7 years old, and had insisted she say it correctly, not as a performance, but as a real greeting, with the weight it deserved. The dialect was not something you could look up. It was not in any app. It came from a very specific place on the southern coast of Korea, a city called Tongyeong, and it was the way people from that coastal region spoke to elders they respected. London had asked her grandmother once why they needed to know it. Soon, he had just smiled and said, "Because someday you might meet someone who needs to hear it." She had not understood that then. She kept the greeting stored in her the way you keep something you don't want to lose, carefully, in the part of you that doesn't throw things away. Choi Jae-sung was standing at the window when she entered, looking at the lake. He did not turn around immediately, which London took as her cue to wait. So she waited, hands folded, eyes respectful. "Mr. Choi," she said softly. "Good morning. I'm London, the new domestic assistant. I wanted to introduce myself properly." He turned then, and London, doing what her grandmother had taught her, bowed her head slightly and said the greeting in Sunyi's dialect, the old coastal Tongyong words, the intonation that went up at the end like a question, the way the vowels sat differently in the mouth than modern Korean. She had barely finished speaking when she heard it, the sound a man makes when his breath leaves him all at once. Not a gasp. Something smaller and more devastated than that. She looked up. Choi Jae-sung was gripping the back of an armchair. His face had not simply changed expression, it had changed entirely, like a photograph developing in reverse, all the control and composure being drawn back out of it, leaving something raw underneath. He stared at her as though she had just said something she had no earthly right to know. "Where?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you learn to say that?" It was not a question. It was something between a demand and a prayer. London blinked. "My grandmother taught me. She was Korean. She raised me." For a long moment, Jae-sung did not speak. He simply stood with his hand on the chair and his eyes doing something complicated and private. Then, very deliberately, he seemed to put himself back together, like watching a house of cards reassemble itself from the floor. He straightened. He smoothed his jacket. He looked at her with an expression that was almost neutral, almost controlled, and would have fooled anyone who hadn't just watched it crumble. "Welcome to the household," he said. Then he turned back to the window. London left the room with the very strong feeling that she had opened a door she hadn't known existed, into a room she was not supposed to see. She met Seo-won that afternoon. She hadn't expected to. She'd been told he kept to his office until at least 6, but she was carrying fresh linens down the second-floor corridor and turned a corner, and there he was, coming out of his office with a phone pressed to his ear and his other hand pushing his hair back from his face, the gesture of a man who had been staring at spreadsheets too long. He stopped when he saw her. Not because of anything dramatic. He simply hadn't expected anyone to be in the hall. His eyes found her face, took her in quickly the way people do when they encounter something they weren't prepared for, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief she almost missed it, something passed across his expression. Not recognition, something else. Something that looked, if she'd had to name it, like a question he hadn't meant to ask himself. He recovered immediately. The phone went back to his ear. He walked past her without a word. But he didn't resume his phone conversation right away. London kept walking. She pressed the linens against her chest and told herself that meant nothing, and almost believed it. In the weeks that followed, London learned the rhythms of the Choi estate the way you learn a piece of music, slowly at first, then by feel, until it ran in the background of your movements without requiring thought. Jae-sung rose at 6. He spent an hour in meditation in the East Garden regardless of weather, standing at the center of the stone path in whatever the lake wind was doing that morning. He took his breakfast alone. He did not talk during it. He read physical newspapers, not digital ones, and he folded them with a precision that London found quietly moving. There was a respect for the paper itself, for the crispness of it, that felt like a habit formed somewhere very specific in the past. He did not speak to London again about what had happened that first morning, but whenever she was in a room he occupied, something in him changed. A subtle alertness, not hostility, something more complicated. He was watching her, not the way someone watches an employee, the way someone watches a problem they haven't yet decided how to solve. London filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things she couldn't explain, and returned to her work. CO1 was harder to read and easier to think about, which was its own kind of problem. He worked 14-hour days as a baseline. He drank his coffee black and cold, having apparently given up on it being hot sometime in his 20s and never reconsidered. He had a habit of tapping his pen against his lower lip when he was thinking that London noticed entirely against her will. He spoke on conference calls with a controlled directness that made entire rooms, even rooms he was not physically in, rearrange themselves around what he was saying. He was not unkind to her. He was, if she was being precise about it, almost nothing to her in the way that wealthy people sometimes manage to be nothing to the people who clean their houses, not through cruelty, but through a kind of practiced unawareness that was its own form of distance, except that it wasn't entirely consistent. 3 weeks in, she was in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, earlier than usual because she couldn't sleep, making herself tea. She didn't expect anyone to be up. And then Seo-wan came in, still in the clothes he'd apparently been wearing all night, and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with the expression of a man who had run out of the capacity to be surprised by anything. He stopped in the doorway, took her in. "Early?" "Couldn't sleep," London said. She moved toward the cabinet to take her mug and leave. "I'll get out of your way." "You don't have to." She paused. She wasn't sure why those 3 words landed the way they did. They were not particularly warm. Not particularly anything. But there was something in the flatness of them that felt, oddly, like an invitation he wasn't sure he meant to extend. She stayed. She finished her tea. He made himself what appeared to be his 4th or 5th coffee of a very long night. And they existed in the same kitchen in a silence that was less uncomfortable than it had any right to be. He left without saying anything else. London stood with her mug and wondered what she was doing. She called her best friend Dara in Atlanta on a Sunday, sitting cross-legged on her staff room bed with the window cracked and the lake doing its dark, restless thing outside. "He told you that you didn't have to leave," Dara said, in the tone of a woman preparing to over-invest in this information. "At 7 in the morning, after an all-nighter." "It was not a moment," London said. "London, honey, baby." It was literally 3 words. Exactly 3 words. London pulled her knees to her chest. "I work for his family, Dara." And nothing. That's the whole sentence. "I work for his family, and therefore nothing." There was a pause. Then Dara said, more gently, "How's the rest of it? The old man still giving you weird energy?" London thought about Jae-sung at breakfast with his folded newspaper. The way he looked at her like she was a sentence he was trying to translate. "Yeah, but he's not mean about it. He just seems unsettled, like I remind him of something." "Maybe you do," Dara said simply. London looked at the small photograph she'd put on her nightstand. Her grandmother at maybe 60, standing in front of a magnolia tree, eyes already beginning to hold that soft, inward look that came to her in her last decade. Soon-Yi had died in 2020, 6 years ago, and London still reached for the phone to call her sometimes. "I miss her," London said, not quite connecting it to anything she'd just said. But Dara understood. Dara always understood. "I know," Dara said. "She was something else. She never told me anything, though, about where she was from, about her life before me." London picked up the photograph, turned it in her hands. Just the dialect, the food, the songs, all this texture of a place, without the map. Maybe that was all she could give. London set the photograph back down carefully. "Maybe," she said, and let the lake fill the silence. Choi Jae-sung was not a man who left things unresolved. He had built a company from 12 employees to 1,200 through a combination of patience, calculation, and the particular kind of ruthlessness that passes for wisdom when applied correctly. He had survived the IMF crisis of 1997. He had navigated 4 recessions and 2 industry upheavals. He had buried his wife, raised his son, and done it all while maintaining the composure that was, for him, not a performance but a philosophy. Control was not the suppression of feeling, it was the correct placement of it. And yet, a young woman had walked into his house and said 8 words in a dialect that no one had spoken to him since 1987, and he had nearly collapsed against a chair. He sat in his study that evening with a glass of whiskey he was not drinking, and thought about Sun-Yi. He had been 32 years old. It was March 1987, and he had been in Tongyong for a business visit that had gone badly. A negotiation collapsed, a partnership dissolved, and he had taken his rental car north along the coastal road because he needed the air and the motion and the sound of the water. He had been driving too fast. He had been angry. He had not seen the patch of ice until the car was already off the road and down the embankment into the shallow inlet. The front crumpled against the rocks, the cold water starting to come in through the passenger door. He had been conscious but badly disoriented. His shoulder was broken. He could not get the door open. The water was rising. She had appeared at the car window as if she had come from the water itself. She was maybe 45, compact and unhurried in the way of a person who had never needed urgency to be effective. She had broken the window with a rock, pulled him through it with a strength that had no business living in her frame, and dragged him up the embankment and into a warmth and a smell of cooked rice that he associated, afterward, with the very simple fact of being alive. She had kept him for 3 days in the small house above the inlet, setting his shoulder with the expertise of someone who had done it before, perhaps many times, feeding him, speaking to him in that dialect that he had not heard since his own grandmother's generation. He had asked her name. She had told him, Sun-Yi. He had asked how to find her again, to repay what she had done. She had laughed and said there was nothing to repay. He had insisted. She had smiled and said, "Then do something good for someone else. That is the only repayment I want." He had left on the 4th day. He had meant to go back. He had written the village name on a piece of paper and put it in his desk drawer. Life had intervened. Business, marriage, a son born in 1992. The paper had migrated through 3 different desks and 2 office relocations and had finally disappeared sometime in the late 90s. And Jae-sung had told himself that he would look it up properly when he had time, and the years had continued doing what years do. He had never gone back. Now he sat with his undrunk whiskey and thought about a woman who had pulled him out of a car in a frozen inlet and asked for nothing, and whose granddaughter had walked into his house and said her words in her voice. And he felt something that a less composed man might have called the precise, specific weight of 39 years of a debt that had never been paid. He did not feel guilt the way emotional people did, as a flooding. He felt it the way structural engineers recognize stress fractures, quietly, precisely, with a full understanding of what would happen if left unaddressed. And the complicating factor, the one that made his jaw tighten whenever he watched his son from across a room, was that Seo-won was already watching the girl. He was doing it the way Seo-won did everything he didn't want to acknowledge, obliquely, carefully, as if he could make it invisible through indirection. But Jae-sung was his father. He had been watching Seo-won for 34 years. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He made the call the following morning, before London was awake. He called a woman who ran a private research service in Seoul that he had used twice before for background checks on potential business partners. He gave her the name Sun-Yi, Tongyong, Southern Coast. Born approximately 1942, died approximately 2020 in the United States. A granddaughter, American, currently in Chicago. The researcher said she would have something within 72 hours. Jae-sung hung up the phone and looked out at the lake. He had not decided yet what he would do with the information. He told himself he was only looking. He told himself it was responsible to know. He was very good at telling himself things. April arrived and the lake shifted from gray to something almost blue, and the estate opened its windows for the first time since London had arrived, and suddenly the house breathed differently. She had found, over the past weeks, a kind of careful equilibrium. She did her work. She was good at it. thorough and quiet and anticipatory in a way that good domestic staff always are, seeing what needs doing before it's asked. Mrs. O had told her, with the closest thing to warmth she apparently possessed, that she was the best hire they'd made in 3 years. London had thanked her and gone back to folding laundry. The equilibrium with Seo Wan was more precarious. It was not anything overt. There was nothing she could point to and say, "There, that is the problem." It was the accumulation of small frictions, small catches in the air between them. The way he always seemed to register her presence in a room before she'd announced herself. The way their eyes found each other across the breakfast table and then looked away in the same instant, like two people who had agreed on something without discussing it. One afternoon in mid-April, she was dusting the library, a room she loved, floor-to-ceiling shelves, the smell of old paper. And she did not realize he was there until she turned and found him sitting in the chair by the window with a book open in his lap, watching her with an expression that was not quite neutral. "Sorry," she said, reaching for her cart. "I didn't know you were in here. I'll come back." "London." He said her name with a flatness that was not unkind, just direct. "Stop apologizing for existing in rooms." She stopped. "Pardon?" "You apologize every time you encounter me. You've been doing it for 6 weeks. You don't need to." She considered this for a moment. Part of her wanted to apologize for apologizing, which she recognized was precisely the problem. "Habit," she said instead. From where?" She picked up her cloth and resumed dusting, because the conversation felt safer if her hands were doing something. "My grandmother used to say I took up space apologetically. She spent a lot of time trying to convince me I was allowed to simply be somewhere." A silence. Then, "She sounds like she was wise." "She was everything," London said. Simply, no performance in it. Just the truth in its plainest form. She felt rather than saw the quality of Seo Wan's attention shift, something settling in it, like a key turning in a lock. "When did she pass?" he asked. 2020, March. I was 22. London kept her eyes on the shelf. "She raised me from when I was 3. My mom, it doesn't matter. She raised me. She was my whole family." She had not meant to say that much. But the library had that quality. Old rooms often did. Something about the accumulated silence of books made you say true things. She waited for him to say he was sorry for her loss, the way people did, filling the space with the correct formula. He didn't. Instead he said, "What was her name?" That landed differently, like he was asking for the real thing, not the summary. "Soon Yi," London said. She heard him put his book down. She did not turn around. A beat of silence. Then quietly, as if he were turning something over in his hands. "That's a beautiful name." She nodded, still facing the shelf, and pressed her free hand briefly against her sternum, where grief lived and breathed. She found the photograph entirely by accident. She had been reorganizing the east sitting room storage cabinet, a task that had been on the household list for weeks, and that no one had gotten to. And in the back of the bottom shelf, behind a set of crystal decanters that hadn't been used in years, she found an old shoebox. She almost didn't look inside. She was not the kind of person who looked inside things that weren't hers. But the box had a dried magnolia blossom tucked under the lid, pressed flat, brown at the edges, unmistakably intentional. And magnolias were her grandmother's flower, the one she grew in pots on every windowsill of every apartment they'd shared. And it was the kind of coincidence that didn't feel like coincidence. She opened the box. Inside was a small collection of items, a folded piece of cloth, a dried fish bone that had been lacquered and strung on a thin cord, a handwritten note in Korean she couldn't read, and at the bottom, a photograph. A young man, perhaps early 30s, on a cot. He was clearly in pain. You could see it in the set of his jaw, the angle of his held shoulder, but he was looking up at something off camera with an expression that was purely, uncomplicatedly grateful, the face of someone who had just been pulled back from a very close edge. Standing at the edge of the frame, partially cut off, was a woman's hand and forearm. London recognized the jade bracelet on the wrist without needing to think about it. She had last seen that bracelet in 2020, on her grandmother's wrist at the funeral home. London sat down on the floor of the east sitting room with the photograph in her hands and simply breathed for a while. Then she looked more closely at the young man's face. She had only seen Choi Jae-sung at 71, the settled, careful, controlled version of him. But faces carry themselves forward, certain structures persisting through decades. The jaw, the line of the brow, the specific way the eyes were set. She put the photograph back in the box. She put the box back in the cabinet exactly where she had found it. She stood up, smoothed her clothes, and finished organizing the shelf. She did not tell anyone what she had found. She did not even let herself fully think about what it meant. Not yet. She put it in the same careful internal drawer where she kept things that needed time. Things that were too large to process standing up in someone else's house. But that night, lying in her room with the lake outside the window, she heard her grandmother's voice. Someday you might meet someone who needs to hear it. And she thought, or someone who needs to understand what they never went back to say. The report arrived on Jae-sung's encrypted email on a Thursday. He read it twice. Then he sat very still for a long time. The researcher had been thorough. Soon-yi had been born in 1942 in Tongyong. She had lived in that region her entire life until 1988, 1 year after the accident, when she had emigrated to the United States, sponsored by a church organization in Atlanta. She had worked as a seamstress for 11 years, then as a home caregiver. She had never married. She had one child, a daughter born in 1975 to a father the records did not name. This daughter, a woman named Cora, had struggled with addiction for much of her adult life and had minimal presence in the records beyond a series of address changes. In 2001, when Cora's daughter London was 3 years old, Soon-yi had taken legal guardianship. She had raised London alone on a seamstress's wages and a caregiver's wages, and a particular fierce kind of love that no researcher could document. She had died in March 2020. She had been 78 years old. She had owned almost nothing. She had left London a box of personal items, some photographs, and a small insurance policy. Jae-sung closed the report. He thought about the company he had been building in 1987. The empire that had taken shape in the years after Tongyong. The houses, the staff, the private cars, the portfolio that was now worth more than the GDP of some small nations. All of it set in motion in a life that had continued, full and layered and successful, while a woman in Atlanta pressed seams and changed bedpans and raised someone else's child because no one else would. He was not a man who wept. He had not wept since his wife's funeral. But he sat in his study on a Thursday afternoon and felt the weight of 39 years settle onto him with a completeness that no calculation had prepared him for. And then, because he was the kind of man he was, he began to think about what to do. The girl had to go. It was the cleanest solution. She could not be here. Not with Seo-won looking at her the way he was looking at her. Because if Seo-won fell for her, which he was already in the process of doing whether he knew it or not, eventually the whole story would have to come out. The accident, the debt, the 39 years of nothing. And Seo-won would look at his father and see a man who had built everything on an unpaid obligation to a woman who died with very little. Better to remove the situation before it became the story. He told himself this was protecting his son. He was very good at telling himself things. He waited for a moment when London was alone. He found her in the laundry room on a Friday morning, folding fitted sheets with the patient precision of someone who had made peace with the fact that fitted sheets were simply a challenge of geometry. He closed the door behind him. London turned and saw him and did what she always did, arranged herself into careful, unassuming professional stillness. "Good morning, Mr. Choi." He came directly to the point, because circling it would only make him lose his nerve. "I would like to offer you a severance package. 4 months of salary, paid immediately, in addition to an employment reference that I can assure you will open any door you choose to knock on. I would ask that you be gone by the end of the week." London went very still. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said. Her voice was measured, quiet, but something in it had shifted. A quality of dignity that Jae-sung recognized suddenly, and with a pain that surprised him, because it was the same quality the grandmother had, the same refusal to be diminished. "No," he agreed. "You have not." "Then why?" He looked at her. He almost said it. He could feel the shape of the whole story pressing up against the inside of his ribs, looking for the door. But what came out instead was, "This is a private household matter. The offer is generous. I would recommend you accept it." She held his gaze for a long, steady moment, and then she nodded once, small and deliberate, the way people nod when they understand something they have not been told. She turned back to the fitted sheets. "I'll be gone by Friday." She turned back to the fitted sheets. The conversation was over. Jae-sung left the room. In the corridor, he stood for a moment with his hand pressed to the wall and his eyes closed, and he thought about a woman pulling him through a car window in the cold, and he kept breathing until he could walk again. London told no one. She packed slowly. Over 3 days. The way you pack when you are trying to stay calm, and the calmness is a choice you keep having to remake every 20 minutes. She did not understand what had happened. She had the photograph in her mind, the young man on the cot, her grandmother's bracelet at the edge of the frame, and she had Jae-sung's face on the first morning, and she had the abrupt dismissal with no explanation, and she was not stupid. She could see the shape of something. She just couldn't see all of it yet. She thought about telling Seo-won. She discarded the thought almost immediately, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't know what she would even say. "Your father knew my grandmother. I think. I found a photograph. I don't know what it means. And I'm leaving on Friday, and maybe it doesn't matter." It mattered. She knew it mattered. But she had spent her whole life learning not to push into spaces that weren't offering themselves. And the habit was deep. She saw Seo-won on Wednesday evening. She was coming out of the kitchen, and he was coming down the stairs. And they did what they always did. Registered each other, managed the moment, redistributed the air. Except this time he stopped. He looked at her face with the focused attention she'd learned to recognize. The one he used when he was reading a situation he hadn't been briefed on. "Oh, you look like someone who's made a decision they're not sure about." London almost laughed, because that was startlingly accurate. "I'm leaving at the end of the week. I wanted you to know. I've appreciated working here." She watched him process that. She watched him not ask the obvious question, and then ask it anyway, because he was not someone who could leave obvious questions lying around. "Why?" London looked at a point just past his shoulder. "It's just time." He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man who knows he is not being told the whole thing. "Did something happen?" "No," she said, which was technically true in the way that most technically true things are, leaving out the body of the story while preserving its outline. He did not look convinced. He opened his mouth. And then his phone rang. Work, always work. And he held up one finger and looked down at the screen, and London took that second to say, "Good night, Seo-won," and walk away. She felt his eyes on her back all the way to the end of the corridor. Thursday night, she sat on her bed and wrote a letter to her grandmother. She did this sometimes, not to send, just to say. She wrote, "I think I found something. Helmoni. I think I found the person you saved, or his house anyway. I don't know the whole story. I don't know why you never told me. I don't know if you would want me to say something or if you would want me to let it lie." She wrote, "I think you would want me to let it lie. I think you spent your whole life not wanting a debt repaid, not wanting a fuss, not wanting someone to feel they owed you something. I think that was the whole shape of you. She wrote, I miss you every single day, and I am going to leave this house tomorrow, and I don't know where I'm going yet, but I think that's okay. You always said the path shows itself when you're moving, not when you're standing still. She folded the letter. She put it in her grandmother's old Bible, where all the other unsent letters lived. She went to sleep. She was up before dawn. She had her bags by the door and her succulent under her arm, and she was in the kitchen making one last cup of tea, because she was still her grandmother's granddaughter, and tea was what you made when you needed to be calm. Seo Wan came in at 6:45. He was dressed, which surprised her. He didn't usually come down this early unless he'd been working all night. But he was dressed and alert, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her bags and looked at her face, and whatever he saw in both of those things made him set his jaw in the way she'd come to recognize meant he was arriving at a decision. You're leaving today, he said. I'm leaving today, she confirmed. Before you say it's just time again. He crossed his arms. Did my father say something to you? London looked at him. She thought about the photograph in the cabinet. She thought about her grandmother on the embankment pulling a stranger out of the cold. She thought about all the things Jae-sung hadn't said, and all the things she'd chosen not to push. He offered me a severance package, she said carefully, and I accepted it. She watched that land. She watched Seo Wan's expression travel through 3 or 4 different places before settling somewhere very quiet and very focused. When, he said, Monday, and you accepted it. I did. Without telling me. She put her mug down. I don't work for you, Seo Wan. I work for the household. That's not... He stopped. He pushed a hand through his hair. London. Her name in his mouth had a quality she had noticed before, a specificity, like he was saying it to remind himself of something. You didn't do anything wrong. You shouldn't be leaving. She picked up her bag. Maybe not. But I am. She picked up her mug, finished the tea, rinsed the mug, set it on the drying rack, every gesture careful and final. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel and hung it back precisely. Then she picked up her bag. She looked at him one more time. Thank you, she said. For the library, for the kitchen at 7 a.m, for all of it. She walked out. She did not let herself look back. She had learned, very early, that looking back was the one gesture that made leaving impossible. So she walked down the front steps with her duffel on her shoulder and her succulent under her arm, and she called the car and stood in the early morning cold of the North Shore and breathed the lake air and told herself she was fine. She was absolutely not fine, but she was moving. And her grandmother had always said the path showed itself when you were moving. Seo Wan found his father in the east sitting room at 9 o'clock. He had spent the intervening hours doing 3 things: working, failing to work, and thinking about London walking out of the kitchen with her bag over her shoulder. He had watched the car arrive from the upstairs window. He had watched her get in. He had watched it pull away down the private drive. He had stood at the window for another 3 minutes after that, not thinking anything coherent, just standing. Then he had gone to find his father. Jae-sung was at the window, as he so often was, with his view of the lake. He turned when Seo Wan came in. Why did you pay her to leave? Seo Wan asked. No preamble. He had not practiced this in the measured voice he used for business. This was a different voice. Quieter. More dangerous in the way that quiet is more dangerous than loud. Jae-sung did not deny it. He held his son's gaze and said, There were reasons. What reasons? A pause. The specific quality of his father's silence, Seo Wan had catalogued its varieties over 34 years, was one he recognized, the silence of a man deciding how much truth to deploy. The situation was becoming complicated. What situation? She was staff. She was exceptional at her job. She'd been here 2 months. What situation? Jae-sung looked at his son for a long moment, and Seo-won, who had learned most of what he knew about composure from this man, saw something in his father's face that he had seen precisely twice before. Once when his mother had gotten her diagnosis, and once at her funeral. Not grief, exactly. Something older than grief. Something that looked like accountability. Her grandmother's name was Soon-yi, Jae-sung said. Seo-won waited. His father told him the story. All of it. The coastal road in March 1987. The car in the inlet. The woman who had pulled him out. The 3 days in the small house. The promise to return. The paper in the desk drawer. The years. The report that had arrived last Thursday. When he had finished, the east sitting room was very quiet. Only the lake outside, doing its persistent thing. She died in 2020, Seo-won said. His voice came out stripped down. And London has been here for 2 months, and you paid her to leave because you didn't want me to know. Because you didn't want to be accountable for it. Seo-won's voice did not rise. He did not need it to. Not to me, not to her, not to yourself. Because if she stayed, eventually someone would have to say what you didn't do for 39 years, and you couldn't face that. Jae-sung said nothing. Seo-won turned and walked out of the room. He was in his car in 4 minutes. He had London's phone number in his contacts because Mrs. O kept files on all staff, and he had looked it up sometime in the first month, not with any particular stated purpose, just because he was a man who liked to know things about the people he thought about. He dialed as he pulled out of the drive. It rang 3 times. Then her voice, slightly cautious. Hello? London. He was already on Lakeshore Drive heading south. Where are you? A pause. In a coffee shop in Evanston. Waiting for my bus. Don't get on the bus. Another pause. Longer. Seo-won. I know why he asked you to leave. I know all of it, and I need to see you. Please. The last word was not one he deployed often. She would know that. She had been paying attention to him as carefully as he'd been paying attention to her. Tell me where you are. The coffee shop had mismatched chairs and local art on the walls and excellent coffee. And London was sitting at a corner table with her bags at her feet and her succulent on the tabletop, like a small flag planted in contested territory. She saw him come in. He was still in his work clothes from that morning, no coat despite the April chill, and he scanned the room with the focused efficiency of a man who is not going to allow himself to miss the thing he's looking for. He found her. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the coffee shop went about its business around them, unconcerned. Then he told her everything his father had told him. London listened without interrupting. She was still, that particular kind of stillness she had, the kind that was not passivity, but concentration, the way a deep place in water is still but not shallow. She kept her hands around her coffee cup. Her face moved through things, something opening, something tightening, something that was not quite grief and not quite relief. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, I found a photograph. He looked at her. In the storage cabinet in the east sitting room, an old shoebox, there was a photograph of a young man on a cot, and my grandmother's bracelet at the edge of the frame. I put it back. I didn't tell anyone. She looked down at her coffee. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. She kept it, he said quietly. She kept a record of it for decades, and it was still in that house. She never wanted to be owed anything, London said. And that was the whole shape of her. She gave and she let go. She never collected. A pause. She raised me on a seamstress's wages. She worked so hard. She never asked anyone for anything. Her voice remained steady, just barely. He watched her hold it and did not look away. "I know," he said. "I know what she did, and I know what she didn't have, and I know what my father didn't do. And I'm not going to pretend that any of it is adequate, or that me being here fixes it." He held her gaze. "But I needed you to know that I know. All of it. And I needed you to know that what he did, asking you to leave, that was his fear, not his judgment of you. You did nothing wrong. You have never done anything wrong." She was looking at him with an expression that held many things, and one of them, the one underneath all the others, was the look of a person who has spent a very long time being easy to overlook, encountering someone who is looking at them with their full attention and showing no signs of stopping. She pressed her lips together, looked at the table, looked back up. "You drove here without a coat," she said. He looked down at himself with the expression of a man noticing this for the first time. "Yes, it's 40 degrees. I'm aware." She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the architecture of one. Seo one. "London. What are we doing?" He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I don't know exactly, but I'm not interested in you getting on that bus. I'm not interested in the version of this where you disappear, and I spend the next year pretending I don't think about you every time I walk into the library or past the kitchen at 7 in the morning. He paused. "I have been careful and managed and strategic about everything in my life for long enough that I have become genuinely boring about it. And then you walked into the house and said good morning to my father, in a dialect that broke something open in him, and started dusting shelves with a succulent on your cart. And He stopped. "I don't want you to get on the bus." The coffee shop moved around them. Someone dropped a spoon. The espresso machine hissed. London looked at him for a long time. Long enough that another person might have become nervous. He did not become nervous. "I don't want to get on the bus either," she said. "I've been trying to want to get on the bus for 3 days and it's not working." He exhaled. Something in him that had been very tight loosened. "Okay." The word landed simply, without qualification. London looked at him for one more moment. "Okay." They stayed at the table for another hour. They talked, really talked, in the unguarded way that sometimes only becomes possible in neutral spaces, on the edges of departures, in the aftermath of honesty. He told her about his mother. She told him about growing up with Sun Yi, the songs, the dialect lessons, the smell of the apartment in Atlanta where her grandmother had sewn late into the night with the television murmuring in the background. He told her about the first year after his mother died, the 14-hour days that were really just a very long way of not sitting still with grief. She told him about the feeling of always borrowing a life. He told her she had not been borrowing anything. Outside, April did its thing. The lake was somewhere to the east. They went back to the estate together. London had her duffel over her shoulder and her succulent under her arm, and Siowan walked beside her and opened the front door and held it. And Mrs. O, who was crossing the foyer at that moment, looked at them with an expression of a woman who had developed, over decades of service, a comprehensive philosophy about not commenting on things that were not her department. Jae-sung was in the east sitting room. Of course he was. It was where he sat with things that were too heavy to carry around the rest of the house. They stood in the doorway together. Siowan slightly forward, London slightly back. Jae-sung turned from the window and looked at them. And whatever calculation he had been running seemed to complete itself, because something in him settled. Not resolved. Settled. The way an old fracture stops being sharp and becomes instead a permanent part of the structure. He looked at London for a long moment. "Your grandmother," he said, "saved my life in March 1987. She pulled me out of a car I had driven into an inlet on the coastal road outside Tongyong. I had broken my shoulder. The water was rising. She kept me for 3 days, fed me, cared for me, and asked for nothing." He paused. I told myself I would go back. I did not go back. I have not had a single day in the last 39 years where I did not, on some level, know that London was very still. I did not ask you to leave because you had done something wrong, he continued. I asked you to leave because I was afraid, because if you stayed, the truth would come out, and I would have to stand in front of my son and be seen as the man who built his life on an unpaid debt to a woman who died with very little. His voice did not break, but it thinned. I was trying to protect myself. I told myself I was protecting him. I was lying. The east sitting room was quiet. The lake light came through the windows and did its work on the floor. London stepped forward. She said, in her grandmother's dialect, the words of acknowledgement, not thanks. Because Sun Yi had taught her the distinction. Acknowledgement was not gratitude. It was simply saying, I see what happened between us. The syllables were old and coastal and specific to a stretch of shoreline that existed in both of them now, for entirely different reasons. Jae-sung closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was something there that had not been there before. A nakedness that elderly, powerful men rarely allowed. She taught you well, he said. She taught me everything, London said. She was generous with what she had. And she had more than most people understood, because most of what she had was not the kind of thing you can see from the outside. A pause. Then, quietly, I found the photograph in the cabinet. I recognized her bracelet. Something moved through Jae-sung's face, complex, swift, like weather. I put it there, he said, years ago. After I finally accepted that I was not going to go back, I put it somewhere I would have to look at it. He paused. I did not do well by that obligation. No, London said simply. You didn't. He accepted that. He did not flinch. I would like to make a reparation, not to erase it, there is no erasing it, but a material acknowledgement of what she gave and what she should have had. I would like to establish a scholarship fund in her name, through the university in Tongyong, for young women from that coastal region. I've had the paperwork drawn up since Thursday. A pause. I did not know if I would have the chance to offer it. London looked at him for a long time. She thought about her grandmother at the sewing machine at midnight. She thought about the apartment, and the magnolia plants, and the dialect lessons, and a woman who had carried a secret her whole life because she didn't want a fuss. She would hate the fuss, London said finally. She would absolutely hate a scholarship in her name. Jae-sung almost smiled. I know, he said. I'm doing it anyway. London nodded once, then make it worth her. He held her gaze, and for the first time since that first morning, there was nothing calculating in it. Only the bare, uncovered face of a man who understood exactly what he owed. Yes, I intend to. Later that evening, when the house had found a new kind of quiet, not the old managed quiet, but something more honest, the quiet of a place that has finally said the thing that needed saying, London sat on the East Garden steps with Seo-won. The lake was doing its evening thing, shifting color at the edges. The succulent was on the step beside her. Seo-won's arm was warm against hers, and neither of them was pretending it was accidental. After a while, Seo-won broke the quiet. She never told you. About him. About Tongyong. No. London looked at the water. I think she decided that story belonged to her, that she didn't need to pass the weight of it on. A pause. She passed on everything else. The language, the food, the way of being in the world, just not the occasion for it. But you used it anyway. I just said good morning, London said. I had no idea it was a grenade. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh without the half-second delay of a man monitoring his own expressions. and it was a good laugh, surprised and real. She felt it in her chest like something finally fitting where it was supposed to go. "I noticed you the first day," he said. "In the corridor. I had been on a call for 3 hours, and I turned a corner and there you were with a stack of linens and a look on your face like you were solving a minor philosophical problem, and something—" He stopped. Something what? Something said, "Pay attention." He kept his gaze on the lake. "And I have been, ever since. Against my better judgment, and entirely with my better instincts." London looked at him. His jaw had that line it got when he was allowing himself to feel something fully, without managing it. It was one of her favorite things about him, and she had not let herself name it until this moment. "I put the succulent on the table in the coffee shop," she said, "so that I would have a reason to stay until you got there, in case I lost my nerve." He turned to look at her. "Your grandmother planted you well," he said quietly. London felt the grief and the warmth arrive in the same instant, the way they always did when she thought of Sun Yi accurately. Not edited, not softened, but whole. "Yeah." She looked at the water. She really did. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. She turned it palm up and laced her fingers through his, and they sat there on the garden steps, while the lake went from blue to gray to the particular purple that only happened in the last 10 minutes before dark. And London thought, "I am somewhere I am supposed to be. Not because I was placed here, because I walked in the direction of the things that mattered, and this is where the path led." For the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was borrowing a life. The scholarship ceremony took place in Tongyong in the spring of 2027. Jae-sung flew there himself, which he had not done in 40 years, and stood at a podium in front of 30 young women from the coastal region and said a woman's name into a microphone in the old dialect, and the name was Sun Yi, and he spoke about what she had done and what she had deserved and what he wished he had given her. London sat in the 3rd row. She had come because Seo Wan had asked her to, and because she had wanted to, and because some part of her had always known she was going to end up back in the orbit of her grandmother's story, even without a map. She looked out through the tall windows of the ceremony hall at the southern coast water, the same water Sun Yi had looked at her whole life before Atlanta, and she thought, "You would hate this fuss so much. You would be rolling your eyes so hard right now." And then she thought, "But you would also feel it. You would feel this." She felt a hand cover hers under the table. She looked at Seo Wan beside her. He was watching his father at the podium with an expression that was not quite reconciliation and not quite forgiveness, and was something more complex and more durable than either. The expression of a person who has looked at someone they love clearly, in the full light, and chosen to stay in the room. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. They had a good life after that. Not perfect. Good lives never are, and they would not have trusted a perfect one. They argued about small things and were honest about large ones. Seo Wan learned, slowly, how to be in a room without managing it. London learned, slowly, that she was allowed to need things out loud. They both brought their losses to the table and found that the table was large enough. At some point in that 2nd year, London found her mother. Not because she had been looking. She hadn't. Not actively. Not for a long time. But the same researcher Jae-sung had used in Seoul had a counterpart in Atlanta, and Seo Wan had quietly arranged it. And one evening, he handed London a single page and said nothing and left the room. Cora was alive. 51 years old. Clean for 4 years. Living in Savannah. The page had a phone number at the bottom. London looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her grandmother's Bible, beside the unsent letters. Not a refusal. A not yet. Some doors you open when you are ready, not when they appear. She was her grandmother's granddaughter that way too. London kept the photograph, She had gone back and taken it from the cabinet. Finally, on the day she moved her things properly into the estate, not as staff, but as herself, belonging to no category but her own. She framed it and put it on the mantelpiece in their room, where the morning light hit it first. Her grandmother on the embankment. A young man's wrist visible in the corner of the frame. The inlet water behind them. The coast stretching south. The bracelet, jade, catching the light. She put her own hand over the jade bead that now lived on her own wrist. Jae Sung had given it to her on the day they returned from Tongyong, in a small box, with no words, because some things were better said in silence. And she thought about the particular kind of love that gives without recording, that plants without expecting the harvest, that speaks in a dialect no one else remembers and trusts that someday the right person will know what to do with it. She had known. She had gone toward the right house. She had said the right words. She had found what her grandmother had left for her. Not money, not property, not anything that could be quantified. Just the key. She had been given the key, and she had used it, and everything that mattered had opened.